Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our keynote address with Alejandra Oliva. I want to welcome you all to the 11th Annual Lit Luz Festival of Language, Literature, and Art that is here from October 26th to November 2nd. This one-of-a-kind, cross-cultural bilingual festival brings together renowned writers, visual artists from Mexico and Chicago for a week-long series of public programming at venues throughout Chicago. Lit Luz fosters the creation of new art through international collaborations and facilitates essential dialogues between residents of Mexico and the United States. Inspired by the media landscape of the presidential elections taking place in both countries this year, the theme of the festival is Saturación, Participants will consider concepts such as intensity, combination, absorption, maximums, and limitations as they respond to the urgent political, social, and environmental issues that are confronting both countries. Join us for these 8 days of poetry readings, writing workshops, artist talks, and conversations with participants from Mexico and the US. With few exceptions, most of the events are free and are found in the print program that you all have, as well as our website, litluz.org. Also, feel free to follow us on social media. We're on X and Instagram at MakeLit. Now it is my honor to introduce our 2024 keynote speaker, Alejandra Oliva. Alejandra Oliva is an essayist, embroiderer, and translator. Her writing has been included in Best American Travel Writing 2020, nominated for a Pushcart Prize, and was honored with the Aspen Summer Words Emerging Writers Fellowship. Her book, Rivermouth, A Chronicle of Language, Faith, and Migration, was published by Astra House and received a Whitley Nonfiction Grant. She was also the Yale Whitney Humanities Center Frank Visiting Fellow in the spring of 2022. Author, and she will be joined later in conversation by author and Lit Luz alum Juan Martinez. Juan Martinez is the author of the novel Extended Stay, from Camino del Sol University of Arizona Press, and the story collection Best Worst American from Small Beer Press. He lives near Chicago and is an associate professor at Northwestern University. Please welcome Alejandra Oliva.
Thank you so much. I am so excited to be here with all of you and with a festival that has meant so much to me since I moved to Chicago back in 2019. I want to start by thanking Lit Luz as a whole, obviously for inviting me to give this talk, giving me this platform, and folding me into its community. That alone is such a tremendous honor and one I'm incredibly grateful for. More importantly, though, I'd like to thank them for that community, for creating this kind of space for art to happen, for the exchange of idea and beauty and creativities that happen between Chicago and Mexico in a way that feels so organic and lovely, but actually has a tremendous amount of work and intention and effort behind it. And I'm so grateful for this space to exist. Thank you also for the lovely introduction, and especially also to Juan Martinez, who's going to be joining me up here later to chat. I know from personal experience that it is a ton of work to read someone's book and then figure out what questions to ask them to make the both of you sound smart. And so thank you so much for that. I'm so grateful in advance. So as we've already heard, the theme for this year for Lit and Luz is the idea of saturation, saturación. It's a theme inspired by what it feels like to be a person alive and sort of absorbing media during an election year, the absolute overwhelm and inundation that comes with it. While Mexico has gotten their own election over with, here in the US, we are just about a week and a few days out, and things really feel like they are reaching that saturation point. And it's really intense. It feels like every election that I've been able to vote in, at least, has been described as, the most important election of our lifetimes. And the most challenging thing is I think that they have been. There is so much to care about and so much at stake, both for ourselves and our own safety and our own peace of mind, for our friends and our families, but also for the lives of thousands of people that we may not ever meet. Here in the United States, our election season has included discussions of immigration and whether or not this country should undertake mass deportations of undocumented people, whether we should close our doors to migrants, to people at our doors asking for help. There are also questions of resources. How, as a country, are we spending our money? Are we spending it to make the lives of the people that live here easier and kinder, to provide necessary services to everyone who calls this country home, or to buy bombs that have killed men, women, and children across the globe in Gaza. In Mexico, the issues people voted on back in June were, among other, also questions of migration and of resources. Would they continue collaborating with the United States to militarize their borders, to turn back migrants, often violently? Would they continue allowing multinational corporations to use Mexican resources extractively, leaving behind decimated ecosystems, uninhabitable places that in turn displaced people from their homes? These are not light questions. These are questions of survival. They are questions that ask us at a deeply moral and personal level to think of people other than ourselves. The promise that elections make us is that we, as the citizenry, and more on that in a second, get to answer those questions. But that's a promise that rarely, if ever, gets borne out. Every cycle, elections involve a tremendous amount of organizing, of activism, of demanding better from our Disque representatives within and without the system, and also a tremendous amount of frustration as the understanding sinks in that there are limits to our voices in a political systems that in both countries are saturated with money, with greed, and with the detritus of capitalism. Let's stay here for a minute on this idea of citizenry. Citizenship, as it were, in this country is a highly conditional state. Conditional on your birthplace, the amount of money in your bank account, on your arrest record, and therefore very often on the color of your skin. This citizenship that voting promises has a voice is already a narrow, limited view of who lives in our neighborhoods, who makes up our families, who sits around our tables and makes up our communities. And I think with all of that, not just in the year this year, but generally, these limited hamstrung ways in which we're given a voice on issues that matter en nuestras entrañas, down to our bones. This main feeling I have, what I am saturated with, if you will, is grief. Is this the best we can do? To argue for not the flourishing, not the health, not the growth, but rather just the bare bones survival of our fellow humans, of the earth itself? To continually place questions of capital in opposition to living beings and watch as time and time again the system decides in favor of finance? These are questions that are so lacking in care and compassion and imagination that I can only feel grieved that this is where we are. And I don't think that I'm alone in that. In fact, I feel like every time I talk to someone about, everything that's going on, there's a denial, there's anger, there's bargaining, there's depression, there's a lot of depression. What I am not seeing, and this is maybe more down to the caliber of my friends and loved ones, is acceptance. I'm seeing people continuing to fight, continuing to protest, continuing to make their plans for liberation, despite this hugely expensive political machine grinding its way to election day. And I'd argue that that too is a different kind of saturation. In an essay written in the aftermath of 9/11, the philosopher Judith Butler argues that grief, that desolation at the loss of the other, at dispossession from a community or place, perhaps at the feeling that your country itself has lost its way, that grief shows us the ways and places in which we are entangled with each other. Let's face it, she writes, we are undone by each other, and if we're not, we're missing something. We are undone by each other, but in that, we are also made up of each other. I am made up of my dad's curiosity, my mother's stubbornness, my sister's honesty, my siblings' righteousness, my husband's tenderness, my teacher's lessons, my friends' humor, and their creativity and their care. I am made up of, my politics are made up of, the countless conversations I've had with folks who came to the US to find safety for themselves and their families, of the long talks with colleagues and comrades who are working to make the world a better place, of the people who took the time to correct me when I was ignorant or misinformed. I am made up of all the art that's moved me and the artists who have made it, to the books that have changed me and the people who wrote them. To zoom out even more, I am made up of Lake Michigan and the trees in my front yard and the squirrels that live in those trees, the Skokie lagoons and the blue herons and the muskrats that I saw there every week this summer. I would be undone without them. I would guess that you probably also have your own list of beings that you are made up of too, maybe overlapping and intersecting with mine, your own list of characteristics you borrowed or inherited or learned from the people you love the best, ideas you cribbed from conversations and art, places and people and creatures that feel like home. This in itself is another kind of saturation. It's an acknowledgement that we are permeable, that everything we are we owe to other people, that we exist in webs of love and community and mutuality, an acknowledgement that we are undone by each other, that without the other, we would be lost to ourselves. This is not always an easy acknowledgement, particularly when we live in such an individualistic society, one that elevates self-reliance and pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, one that tells us that someone who can't stand alone is weak. But if I can convince you of anything this afternoon, it is to lean even farther into that saturation, to not just acknowledge, but to celebrate the ways in which we are entangled and porous, in which we are woven into one another. Take language. I'm a translator. I work between English and Spanish, transferring one to the other and back. There's something all-encompassing about translation. It takes your whole brain, obviously, in making connections and deciphering new ways to say the same thing, but it also takes your body, gut feelings, and the memories so deep they're stored in your bones. When I speak Spanish, I'm speaking the language of Cortés and Namalintzin, Sor Juana and Gioconda Belli, Cervantes and Marqués. It's also my own language, the words taught to me by my mother when I was just learning to ask for what I wanted, the made-up language composed of malapropisms of my siblings and I as we were learning to talk, the borrowed words from English, the patterns of sentences and 1980s slang I unknowingly absorbed from my parents' way of speaking and made my own. This language is the water I stand in, the well I draw from. There are tributaries feeding my spot in the river, both above and below the earth. This same river, a little further upstream, is the one the 17th century poet nun, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, drew from. And when I say the word mujer or the word fe, these are words that have been fundamentally altered by her having written about them some 300 years ago. The Spanish she wrote, in turn, was as influenced by her time in the viceroy's court as a lady-in-waiting as it was by the náhuatl she learned from her mother's household staff as a child, as influenced by the Spanish of Hernán Cortés, who had first come to Mexico just 129 years before her birth, as by the language of Malintzin, the Nahua woman who served as his interpreter, his slave, and the mother of one of his children. This was the water Sor Juana drew from, and what she returned to the river was forever altered by having passed through her hands. When I speak or write, my words flow out from my own little eddy to rejoin the wider stream. My turns of phrase become part of the Spanish that exists in the world, just as Sor Juana's did, able to be picked up and passed around, drawn up to drink from, and to be appropriated by another waiter. In this way, language is made up of the personal and the cumulative, each of us standing in our own space, absorbing the words around us and contributing to the greater stream. Like the waters of the river, it's an inevitable, inseparable commingling of the collective and the individual. Language would not work if we could not share it, but the individual impressions we leave and the baggage we bring with us on each word we say matter too. Language and writing, this thing that I've given my life to, this thing that permeates me, is the result of the same kind of interweaving. It allows us to bring into our minds friends and strangers alike, the genius of Sor Juana and the equal, if a little different genius of whatever teen girl first gave us, pero like, what? All this language is all the more powerful for having been co-created. Every conversation a miracle of individuality and collaboration. Literature and art are places where that interrelation is easier to celebrate because we have names and practices for it. We call it citation or acknowledgement or collaboration or reference or homage, and art gives us language to be deliberate and generous in pointing out the places where our work is made up of the work of others. And that is essentially what we're here to celebrate this week during Lit Luz, the building of relationships, the artistic interdependencies between two countries, the ways that we have, despite borders and politics and distance, wrapped our minds around the same questions, made the world clearer by using each other's work as lenses to see it better. It is a very specific kind of acknowledgement of who we are to one another. The collaborations that this festival makes space for highlight the ways that our passions and talents and interests fit together to create a more coherent, more vibrant whole, show us that engaging in this kind of togetherness can lead in surprising new directions. And so then, what is left to us as artists and audience, if such a distinction can be made in a room like this, but to take those lessons and carry them out into the world, into what remains of this election year and beyond it. I've talked a little bit already about how difficult and frightening it can be to acknowledge that we are reliant on one another. And I think that fear is over and over again reflected in our isolationist, nativist national policies, big, beautiful border walls and mass deportations, and for that matter, sharply curtailing asylum and not acknowledging the presence or the human rights of the millions of undocumented people that already live in this country. These are all reflections of that fear. I think that the grief that I open this talk with, the grief that I think many of us may share, is in fact an absence of that fear. It's an acknowledgement of how much we have to lose by separation and fragmentation of our communities, an acknowledgement of how much we have already lost. It can be so easy to have this version of the story be the one that sinks into you, that shapes your actions. There are so many ways that the system is set up that lets this grief and these losses feel inevitable, that lets you get saturated with the bad rhetoric and the sadness and the anger. And these are not feelings that are useless by any means. This anger and sadness can take us to the streets, it can push us into demanding change, but they're also feelings that are unsustainable. What I am calling you to do is not just to vote as interdependent beings, but to live like them. To let yourself be saturated not by fear, but by the relationships that sustain you. To find ways to use artistic practice of citation and borrowing and reference and homage in your day-to-day life and name them, even if just to yourself. I'm making coffee in the way that my mom taught me. I am at this protest to honor my friend who can't come out today. I'm looking after my neighbors in the way my grandmother looked after me. I understand this issue differently because once I watched someone online share their life with me in a video and it changed my mind. This too, in its own way, gives us a reason to fight and change things, reminds us that our voices and our actions are strongest when they are collective and embodied, re-embeds us in the communities our political systems seek to alienate us from. We live in a world that seems intent on saturation, whether it's the TV in our doctor's waiting room or the doom scroll that is always just a few clicks away on our phones, or the endless, meaningless political coverage that we're all inundated with. But I think there's something of a choice in what kinds of saturation we let in. We can choose instead to fill ourselves up with the people around us, with the sun on changing leaves, with favorite books and new ideas and art made by people and not machines. To take the grief and honor its origins and everything beautiful around us. I can't promise that I am 100% there, that I figured out how to be this completely fearless, enlightened figure, because again, it's so hard not to be scared this year. There are real things at stake that are scary. But I do think in joining the world of immigration advocacy for me, in finding out how to turn a language that binds me into my family and home and safety, into a language that I use to help usher other people into safety, I at least started to move in that direction. And now, because I already thought and wrote a great deal about that transition and what making that move was like, and because Lit Luz asked me to do a reading from my book, From Rivermouth, I think I will let the me of a few years ago tell you about what that change looked like. So I'm going to do a quick reading from Rivermouth from close to the end, because I think that's a section that really ties into what I wanted to talk about today. So, when you are translating, you are constrained by what you see on the page. If you miss the way that two words flow sibilantly into one another, or don't know the meaning of an aphorism or maxim, then they don't turn up in what you create. A sentence carefully crafted for the way it sounds read aloud falls flat. This guy literally begins to ring cats and dogs. This kind of mistake is invisible to most readers who will never read both the original and the translation, who probably don't know enough of the source language to clock a sloppily translated axiom. But this is also the kind of mistake that might keep a translator up at night. What injustice did you do to the original? What nuances in the text does your audience have no hope of grasping because they flew over your ignorant head entirely? The same thing happens with writing, which is, after all, translating the real world into language. I can't write something I haven't seen, can't transmit the entirety of reality to you on the page, because I can't see it all. This kind of misreading or blindness also keeps me up at night. Am I doing the stories I tell justice? Am I missing content and context that then you will also miss? It is so easy to lean on simple stories to avoid doing the work and making sure I am saying what I want to say, getting across the important thing. The stories we tell ourselves, the stories we receive culturally, also work as blinders, giving us quick mental shortcuts to a misconception or letting us take the way out of the story that makes us feel the least bad. We prefer to gloss over complexity in preference of a simple story, easy to tell and understand and respond to. They're the equivalent of a word-for-word translation, getting the skeletal facts down, but otherwise kind of oddly constructed and ungainly, easily misunderstood. They fall apart under any kind of close scrutiny. So much of our current immigration system, the stories in the media, the laws that are written, are meant to be like those word-for-word translations. They supply us with the easy stories, the bad hombres or the children in cages, and through them, legions of other stories are erased, thousands of other contexts and individual lives papered over. or omitted from the record in favor of the easy story, the digestible one. It is easy to be moved to emotion and action by these stories, to anger or grief or fear, to protest, but it is just as important to keep paying attention even as the big stories run out, even as the narrative unspools into a gray area. The very existence of the immigration laws we have today are proof of this. Our immigration laws specifically were created to respond to a single story, and for narratives outside of that, the aid we can offer is hamstrung by the laws we are governed by. Our asylum laws are based on ideas about religious and ethnic persecution that began during the Holocaust and are narrowly crafted to prevent another state-organized genocide, and only that. During the Second World War, national immigration quotas based themselves on a story about other nations overrunning the United States with floods of immigrants, might be a familiar story, kept the MS St. Louis full of German Jewish refugees who couldn't claim a formal kind of immigration assistance, floating off the coast of the United States, so close they could hear the music from Miami nightclubs. The St. Louis eventually turned around and docked again in Europe, resulting in the deaths of about a quarter of its passengers in German concentration camps. In response to that great horror, we have expanded our story once, and we need to expand it again today. Our immigration laws and the story that inspired them since the 1950s keep us from being able to help the man from Haiti who is legitimately afraid of returning home because of rising sea levels and a lack of local infrastructure. The United Nations predicts that by 2050, between 25 million and 1 billion people worldwide will be climate refugees, displaced by droughts, floods, fires, and rising seas. Our immigration laws force us to treat the man with a possession charge who has been in the United States for all but the first year of his life differently from the man who, with a possession charge, who was born here. Both get a few months or a year in prison, but at the end of that time, we tell one of them he has paid his debt to society and can go home, while the other is incarcerated for even longer, separated from his family and community, and eventually sent to a strange country he may barely remember. Today's immigration laws ask us to ignore violence against people unless it happens under deeply specific circumstances, ask us to formulaically and easily refuse to help those who, were we to actually listen, we would extend ourselves for. You make a personal politics the same way you translate a text, the same way you write a book. You look at the world around you, and there are things you notice, and there are things you don't. If you're lucky, read the words of other people who have looked out on the world before you, who have caught other things you didn't. You change your mind, change your actions, start seeing things you had been blind to before. There are many things that, because of the family, the place in society that I was born into, I had the luxury of learning slowly, of learning only intellectually and never emotionally, until someone who had learned them the hard way was kind enough to show me. There are other things, other experiences I know other people to be blind to that I've felt down to my bones. This book is about immigration, but it's also about reading and rereading, going over passages in your life, poring over someone else's words until you find your own life irrevocably altered. I can't go back to the person I was before helping people translate asylum applications in a church basement in New York, before El Chaparral in Tijuana watching people getting ready to cross the border, before the Boston courtroom where I did immigration court observation, or the immigration detention center along the Mississippi. I can't unbecome my parents' daughter, can't unlearn Spanish or unteach myself English. And so I'm left to return to these things and places over and over, to draw strength from them to see the world more clearly, to think of them not as the facts of a biography, but as tools to dismantle walls, tools to fling open doors and beckon people in. Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, Alejandra.
Hi.
Hi, that was beautiful.
Thank you so much.
So one of the things that I jumped out at me almost immediately from both the reading, but also from the book, which was amazing, by the way, is how good you are about sort of triangulating between the actual physical environment that is happening, and then also how that actually sort of moves and affects people as they're crossing, right? like that Rivermouth is both the title, but it's also very much the river itself is part of the.
Yeah.
Anyway, like, I was just kind of wondering, both struck by that, but also like, how did that physical reality that was sort of like laying away in migration, like, start becoming clear to you?
Yeah, I think that when you go to any one of these spaces, they are so full of people who are assigning different meanings to them. They feel like deeply symbolic places, even when you're just like walking around them and interacting with people. They all feel heavy and complicated, and there are different people who are coming to them with different feelings and ideas about what should be happening there. And so it felt really important to connect sort of the myth of the place with the actual place and tie them together in some way in the book, because like a border is never just a border wall is never just a border wall. There are always 1,000 different meanings that it can have. It means things to people logistically, it means things to people intellectually, it means things to people sort of on a ideological level. And so it felt important to unpack all of that, or to combine all the things, because it's never just a simple place. It's always a complicated, thick place.
Right, and then my two favorite moments, I mean, I think I mentioned one of them, where they're like the Tijuana crossing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where, like, in order to cross, you're also, like, in the zigzag of ramps, right? But then the other one that really struck me was the church service that happens at the other end of the the border, but, like, also, like, the way in which the wall juts out into the ocean. I was just wondering if you could
describe that
because it's so cool.
Yeah, so this happens at Las Playas de Tijuana, which is the Tijuana beach, and it is this place where you see this border wall that I think was built in the Clinton administration. That's this big, tall, rusting thing, and it's been graffitied extensively on the Mexican side. I believe on the US side it's blank because there's like an additional wall that keeps people from getting even close to the border wall itself. And so it's this big wall, and it's kind of, as you're driving to the beaches, it's sort of like following the landscape next to the highway, and you see it like go up and down hills and curve around things. And then you get to the beach and you get out of the car and you walk down to the beach, and the border wall's still right there next to you. And it just goes out into the ocean like 100 feet. Just like, this is still part of it. This is still a line in the sand. And there's a practical reason for that, which is to keep people from swimming around it and sort of landing in the US. It's still pretty swimmable, I think, but
Well, people do it, right?
yeah, it's a symbolic place, like I said. But it's also so weird. Like, this ocean is Mexico and that ocean is the United States, and they're different, and there's a line here, and like, we're gonna keep that going kind of across the Pacific if we can. And then every Sunday, there is a bilingual, binational church service that happens there. Half of the congregation is on the Mexican side, half of the congregation is on the US side. Like I said, the US side is like a little farther out because there's an extra border wall. But they have like big speakers and radios so that they can hear each other, and they will sing the same songs in 2 languages. There will be different kinds of speakers and readers on both sides of the wall. And it feels like such a weird, cursed church service, because it's in the middle of this hugely like violent, hubristic place of like, this is where nations end, and this is the line that we are drawing literally in the sand between one country and another. And having a church service there is like inviting God into this place that feels so foolishly and entirely human. And I get why it happens, but it's also a very weird place to find yourself in on a Sunday morning.
It is. And it also brought to mind something that I found was really cool about the book, and that was your own background going into it. And by that I mean both your experience with translation theory and as an active translator. but also theology and your experience in theology school, right? And I appreciated the way that those things would come in and complicate what I think people, all of myself included, even though I have also crossed border, like, but it also feels like I myself internalized a very stock story of what immigration or that movement is.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, like, are there like some favorite things that theology or translation theory or the very act of translation brought to? I mean, a lot. It's all in there, but like, I was just wondering if they're like, you have some favorites.
I think that translation as a whole kind of gives us this idea that languages are very impermeably separated in the same way that like countries and borders are, but also that it takes like a special person to cross from one to the other. It takes a specific kind of skill, which like it does. It takes a specific kind of skill to be able to translate. But there's a lot of people who live in the border, who speak Spanglish, who that is like the main way they communicate, that play with the edges and the borders of both countries. Like I mentioned, the teen girl, whoever she was that invented Pero Like, was a genius that was playing in both places and taking what she wanted from each one and turning it into her own thing. And I think that that's something from translation theory specifically, or like the idea of translation, that especially more recent stuff that is a little weirder and a little more abstract and is a little less, St. Jerome sitting down with the Bible and turning it into a Bible in Latin, that allows for that kind of playfulness and reminds us that there's no such thing as a border, really. It's all a place to play in.
Right. No, and that also just reminded me of like the thing that blew my mind when I started like getting into translation theory is this idea of like that there is a right translation. There's never a correct translation, right? It's always like, okay, you can get close to the target culture and then you'll be further from the source language or, that kind of flux and play.
Yeah, it's all very permeable and very playful.
Yeah. All right, I gotta tell you, like, this is like, there's no good segue for this one, but you say playful, and I just, one of the interesting things that the book does in really funny ways, is this sort of like your own sort of like figure in flux in the space where I'm about to ask about nice white people, basically, but like this idea of like the assumptions that people make because you're like a brown person in a space where the brown people are supposed to be not agents, I guess, just sort of, would love to hear you speak a little bit about that because I felt it.
Yeah, I think it's a very familiar feeling to anyone who is working within their own community in some ways and also in white spaces. And there's a lot of places that this overlaps. I think for me, the immigration movement was one of them because like it's both a lot of Latinos, it's a lot of people with direct experience. I'm not someone with direct experience, but I am Latino. And there's also a lot of folks who come in, many of them are white, who come in and are like, I heard about this on the news and I'm here to help. I'm here to solve things. And they kind of come and they sort of assume everybody has the same story. They assume that all of the other people who look like them are helpers. And they assume that all of the people who look like what they imagine like an immigrant to be are there to be helped. And so, or like, are there because they have direct experience. And so very often I would get people to be like, who were like, are you like triggered because this is like similar to your own story? And I'd be like, it's really not. That is not what I grew. Like my family came to the United States before I was born. So my dad could get a PhD. Like that's a very different story from folks who are walking up the continent to cross over in Tijuana to ask for the chance to get asylum. There is very little that I like. That's not my story. And I always tried to be really honest about that. But people would always, there was so many assumptions about like, oh my God.
I was also struck by that was like definitely one mode, right? Like this assumption, like everybody's story has to be that story, right? But also by the fact that often you would end up being sort of you were doing work, and then you'd be pulled by somebody to translate something that was not particularly urgent or imposing. It's like, no, here, come a sheet. Alejandra speaks Spanish. Let's go and get her to
Yeah, and so it would be like I'd be having a conversation with someone. I'd be like doing my own thing, like talking to someone, answering their questions, and somebody would call me over and be like, "Can you ask her if I can like hold her baby?" And I'd be like, "I can, but like, what? How is this helping? Like, what are you doing here?"
It's gonna make her feel good.
Yeah, and it was, I think, very easy for some people to see me as an agent of help, but an agent of helping them feel good about the work they were doing. And it was very easy to like not think of me as also an agent of help, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Like I said, I wanted to bring it up because I kind of loved those moments, and recognize them a lot. And I was going to say, I'm going to ask this question before my time is up because I want to ask it. I guess that's me I want to hold that baby.
Yeah.
Yeah? Because it's a fun baby. But now I'm going to let that baby go. And I bring up something else that I think your book does really, really well, and that it has to do with like the infrastructure and the systems behind immigration policy, the way that our stories become defined by forms, right? Which I found really interesting. But I was also like blown away by your insights on the shift between immigration hearings that happen in person versus immigration hearings that happen over Zoom.
Yeah.
So if you want to expand on that, that'd be great. But also like how that idea of mediation like plays into our understanding of the crossing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's two things. It's like mediation and like accretion, like the form that you mentioned, the asylum form, the form that anyone has to fill out when they're applying for any kind of immigration help, is one that, like, who wrote that form initially? Where did it come from? Why, like, who is making the changes whenever a new one gets released every couple of years? Like, what kind of political will is behind all of this bureaucracy? Like, how does that happen? And then also, every time one of these policy changes happens, or they're like, oh, we're actually going to like phrase this question a little bit differently, so we have to put out a new form, and like now everybody's got to fill out the new different form, and if you fill out the old one, it's going to get rejected. Whenever that happens, it also changes and like fucks up people's experience of moving through the system, of successfully being able to get the help that they can. It changes the kind of story that they're forced to tell about who they are and why they're coming to the United States for help. It changes a bunch of different things kind of about their process through the system. And I think that's also true when we talk about Zoom hearings in immigration court. And this is a practice that began well before COVID. And it's intended to be a cost-saving measure because very often immigration detention centers are located very, very remotely. So like here in Illinois, there are no longer any immigration detention centers. Great news. But the ones that used to be here were in McHenry and Kankakee, and I think there's another one that I'm forgetting, but like they were kind of far, and all the folks that were staying there, as well as in the immigration detention centers in like Kenosha, and I think even Kentucky is theoretically part of the Chicago immigration court like service area, but all those folks would need to get brought into the physical location of the Chicago immigration court for their hearings. And so eventually when like USCIS discovered Zoom, they were like, what if we just had people sit in a room in their detention centers and have their meetings over Zoom? And so what that made happen is that they would be there over Zoom. It would be one of those awful like conference room cameras that I think we're all really familiar from like hybrid work in the last couple of years. And then they would have a translator or an interpreter beamed in over language line on like the room speakers and not necessarily the speakers on Zoom. And so you're getting this super important, super intense hearing about like what is going to happen to me, what is going to be my fate, and you like can't hear the interpreter super well. The judge can't really like see your face, because at least in the Boston courtroom where I was doing a lot of my court observation, the person's face would be on the wall next to the judge, and like it's a little like awkward, and like it would be, I don't know, it's bad. And it feels, we all know from having spent several years on Zoom, that hanging out with people on Zoom is not the same thing as seeing them in person. It is not the same kind of like, you are a person, you are sitting in front of me. It's just a little guy on your computer that's not real. And so there have been studies done that show that people who have Zoom hearings are less likely to win their asylum cases, that are less likely to win their immigration cases, because of like the weird mediation and dehumanization that this technology sort of imposes between a person and the judge who is judging their case.
Yeah. And I want to be mindful of time. So like this is going to be my last question, because I mentioned we have some Q&A from the audience if they wanted. And I think that this is one of the beautiful things about the book, but also like one of the things that I find that I'm glad that I get to ask you. And it has to do with the fact that we meet so many remarkable people, especially in the first third, as they're about to make their way through, including one who's like very haunting, because like the phone shows up afterwards, but not the person. Yeah. Kind of curious if you could answer this two ways. Like if you have like a favorite person, obviously they're all wonderful, but like a favorite story from these like these incredible encounters of people just as they're about to like cross, and if there were any of these people who sort of resurfaced later after the writing of the book that you can give us an update on. And
yeah, absolutely. So I think the person that I follow the most closely in the first part of the book, her name is in the book Sara, and she was in Tijuana with her partner and their baby, who was a little bit under a year old and had a ton of health problems, had trouble thriving. Yeah, she had heart problems. And then by the time I met her, she was just this like chubby, absolutely like glorious little baby. I wanted to hold that baby. And Sara and her partner decided, because of the way that immigration detention works, they decided that her partner and the baby would cross together first, because men with children are held in detention centers for far less than either families or single men. And if they'd all crossed together, they could have kind of given Sara the baby and let them go, and her partner would have stayed in detention for an indefinite amount of time. So they made this really challenging decision. And so I was, I met Sara when her family was together. I spent a lot of time with her in the days that her family was separated and like deciding to make that choice. And then one day while we were in Tijuana, she gets the phone call that her husband was out, her partner was out, and the baby was out, and she could go decide to cross over and meet them. And she does that. And like we had spent a bunch of time hanging out. We had spent a bunch of time chatting. We were Facebook friends. And so she is someone that I have been able to like keep an eye out on. And as the book was getting ready to come out, I had written about her. And so I translated those sections and I sent them to her, and I was like, hey, are you cool if I publish this about you? And she was like, hey, guess what? My asylum hearing in Quebec is tomorrow. Can I show this to my attorney? And I was like, yes, please do. I changed a lot of things so that like you would be more anonymous, and like there were things I knew you to be nervous about when we were hanging out that I like took out. Like it's a different version of the story, but like, please feel free. And she took it and she read it and she gave it to her attorney. And like a week later, she was like, hey, guess what? I got asylum and I am a citizen of Canada now, which, or not a citizen of Canada, but, safely in Canada without being able to be deported, hopefully eventually a citizen. And that was just really exciting, obviously, for so many reasons. but also like I see pictures of our kids all the time on Facebook and like get to keep track of them and like see them grow up. And that's been really, really exciting. And to know that they're safe now too. I do think it says quite a bit that they decided to go up to Canada instead of staying here and trying to move their asylum case through in the United States during the Trump years. But like, it worked out. She was really mad about having to learn French, though. She was like, I just finished figuring English out, and now I have to do this.
It does feel like a weird thing that academics people do. Alejandra, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
And then people have questions. Alejandra.
I have a question.
Yes.
So, as a writer who is, writing, documenting essentially the stories of other folks, how do you find a way to like balance, being able to document it without also falling into, I guess, the trap of just reinforcing some of like the trauma that folks are working in? Like, what is that process like for you?
Yeah, so I think the case that I feel like very often when I was writing about people's stories, I would write about most people I was not able to follow up with. So like Sada's an exception. And partly is because we hung out and like she's cool. But part of the reason her story gets so much time is because I was able to check with her to make sure that she was okay with being in the book. I was able to change things around if she wanted them changed around. And so that felt like a really important part of the process. And I think the other part is that when you're meeting people, even when you're meeting people in these really stressful situations, they're still like people. They're going to be like making jokes. They're going to be like, I don't know, being people in a way that isn't just like, I'm a traumatized subject, but I'm reacting to that, or I'm making choices, or I am being unique and a whole person in some way. And that felt like the interesting thing to get, because I feel like very often when we are looking at immigrants in the news or like hearing about migration stories, it's very much as like, these are people with horrific trauma and stories that are suffering and miserable. And like, they are people with horrific trauma and stories, but like, they're also people with like jokes, and like, they're hungry and they want coffee, and they are like, I don't know, really worried about what they're packing in their suitcases and like how they're going to be able to get that across. And like, that felt so much more interesting to me than just like rehashing these same trauma narratives. Yeah.
I was going to jump in real quick, and I said that I love that the moment where you talk about like the monastery, like the also loved your like take on like the "don't look away" Instagram posts. There's a whole moment of like people basically just putting that on in every
yeah. There was a huge, I think like later half Trump admin vibe of like hashtag "don't look away," and that was like, don't, but also like, where have you been looking this whole time? Like, where were you looking before the Trump administration? What are you going to do other than look? Looking is, not unimportant, but there's a follow-up there that you get kind of invited into when you see something awful happen, when you see injustice in the world. And I think that is important to keep in mind.
Thinking about being saturated by not just grief, as you were talking about, but like being saturated by the people in your life and your environment and all these things like make up who you are. And then like listening to you right now and thinking about how part of what you're saturated by are also like all these people that you've met and all these stories that you know. And I think it is like a nice place to start constructing an ethic from, like rather
Thank you so much. Yeah, that quote is from an essay that, like I mentioned in the talk, Butler wrote in the aftermath of 9/11. It's in Precarious Life, and it's called Violence Mourning Politics. It might have been anthologized elsewhere also because she is very prolific, and I feel like a lot of her books kind of recombine ideas. But this particular essay, she's really asking the question, like, what constitutes a mournable life? And she talks about a family that tried to get an obit run for their family members who had died in Palestine, run in like the San Francisco Chronicle or something, and the newspaper got real weird about it and was like, these people aren't in our community. And the family said, no, they're in our community. Like, we are in San Francisco and these are our people, like, run this obituary. And then they're like, well, it's not newsworthy. And they're like, that's not really an issue when other people are like trying to get their grandmother's obituaries run. And so I think about that a lot, about like who we consider to be in our communities, who we consider to be people that we would mourn if we lost them, and how that's constituted.
So thank you, Alejandra. So Lit Luz is a language and arts festival. Any favorite artist that kind of deals with the same topics as your book, migration in language? Someone from like contemporary art that does something interesting?
This is an absolute cheat code, but the artist who did my cover is this incredible woman. Her name is Paula de la Calle, and she is Colombian American, and my book is like one example of this, and the items that she chose for my book cover to collage are specific to the book, but she makes these incredible collages and like mixed media, textile, sculptural things. I don't even know how to like describe the like medium that she uses, but they are embroidered and like dense with meaning in so many different ways. And I feel like I actually like asked for her to be my cover artist because I saw her stuff on Instagram and I was like, that's the one. And I was really lucky that it did work out. But I think she's someone that like very, very clearly and pointedly is like working in the same or like analogous fields as mine, doing really cool work.
You spoke earlier about like translation not being like English, Spanish, and it's like the border, right? That artists have the role of like intertwining and manipulating it. And I guess I just wanted to hear from you if you could speak a little bit more about your process and like how if you're writing in English, but maybe you've got the Spanish also, and so then how you as an artist or sort of in your process do that.
That's a really cool question. I think for me, a lot of my very formal education comes in English, and a lot of the reading I do is in English too. I try to like mix it up more than I do. And so I think there's always kind of a moment where you're reaching for something, you're like reaching for the right phrase or the right something, and it comes to you in a language other than the one that you're primarily working in. And I think that like those are the moments for me when it feels good and natural, because I think we're also all very familiar with the like, my mama made me café in the mañana, I love waking up, and it's very like, oh, something is being forced here, something is being pushed into the narrative that doesn't feel right. And I think that putting that in where it really like feels like, that is actually the first word that came to mind, that is what feels best to me. And that's also kind of how I work in Spanish, although very often my Spanish ends up being much more mixed than my English, because it's like a very family oriented vocabulary that I had. The first time I gave an interview on this book in Spanish, I was like, oh my God, there's so many words that I don't know, or like don't know how to talk about in this other language. And like, that was a weird wake up moment for me.
I was gonna say like mi mamá está drinking café. I think Rigoberto Gonzalez called it like, oh no, it's the abuelita story.
Yes.
Like
It's
there's
really
gonna be,
like,
my
mi abuelita made
abuelita's
me
gonna show
café.
up. Yeah.